Hello, everyone. This is Al Fadi, and I want to just thank all of you for watching this amazing series about the possible origin of the Quran, or the prototype of the Quran. For obvious reasons, we showed enough evidence in the last episodes tying the Aramaic language to many of the Quranic content. And today we are going to conclude this entire series for you. And with me here to do this is no other than Dr. J. Smith. Dr. J, thank you so much for doing this. And I think we've done, some service to people, unpacking a number of sources when it comes to the possible origin of the Quran and its connection to the Aramaic language. But you are going to give them today a summary of everything.
Yeah, let's put it into a nutshell. Help them to, before we go out, what exactly have we covered? What's the significance and ramifications of each one of these episodes, each one of these segments? We start out by asking the question that it's on everybody's lips, and that is, so where did this book come from? If it didn't come from God, if it has not been preserved eternally on these tablets, according to chapter 85, verse 22, then where did it come from, Mr. Smith? Al-Fadi, you're saying it didn't, then where did it come from? Now, and we went and we looked at what the modern scholars, what they say. They say, yes, it did. They have this standard Islamic narrative that they've got to hold to, and they cannot go outside of that, of this circle. They have to stay within that circle. And this is like a bowl for them, and they have to sit and put the Quran in the circle and leave it there. And so for them, they have a dilemma, and I'm so sorry for them, because I'm so glad I don't have that dilemma. You don't have that dilemma. They are very clear that this Qur'an, or this archetype, as Van Putten says, or Sidke always says, can be understood just by comparing the texts and the different scripts and the different words that are found, the Talmud Buddha in the different manuscripts. They are all the same. That proves that there must be an archetype from which they're derived. Mm-hmm. And you can see that's desperation on their part, because they're talking about manuscripts that are from the 8th and 9th century. So who cares what's in the 8th and 9th century? By that time, there were Arabic Qurans. What we're asking is much deeper than that. We don't care about the Arabic Qurans. I want to go and see what was before the Arabic Quran, before this Quran was actually put together. And this one, of course, is from 796 from Hafs, or chosen in 1912, but actually was first written in 796. This is 146 years too late to begin with. So why are we even worrying about that? And when I put this into this sieve, I don't just leave it there. I actually want to see what comes out the other end. I want to see what it comes out of. And what we noticed is you start putting it through here, you start asking some much more different questions. You don't sit there and try to impose the narrative onto this. You want to impose history onto it. You want to go to the evidence from the 7th century. And so that was the dilemma for the Western scholars, who are they have only one narrative. And that narrative is, it was from a man named Muhammad, who received it between 610 and 632, that 22-year period. And therefore, they can't move away from that narrative, because that's where their dollars come from. That's where their salaries come from. And that's what everybody has been taught. Now, we then went and asked about what the traditions say. And the traditions, we went to Al Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, and mostly Sahih Bukhari, volume 6, hadith number 509 and 510, where it was very clear from as far as Al Bukhari. But remember, Al Bukhari is writing this in the 850s to 870s. So he's writing the mid to late 9th century. And he is very clear that this all happened because Muhammad received it both in Mecca and Medina. And by the time he died, it was then finished. Mostly from Gabriel, whoever this Gabriel is. By that time, in the 9th century, it was known as an angel. And so he receives it, and then, of course, there's problems with the very first recension, because that is taken from bone stones and people's memory, because so many of them died there in the Battle of Yamama in 632, that they had to quickly preserve it, because showing that you can't memorize it. Memorization wasn't good enough. It had to be written down. But 20 years later, it had to be written down a second time.
Right. Which
is curious. Why do you have to write a second time if you got the first one? Mm-hmm. Just copy it word for word, letter for letter, dot for dot. Oh, wait, there were no dots. That's right. There were no of these harakats, these vowels, dama, kasra, and fatha. That hadn't existed. Those didn't exist yet. So you can see there was a difficulty here. And so what they had to do is they had to burn everything that was different, and then they had to go and introduce these five Quraishi dialect, whatever the Quraishi dialect is. A dialect makes no difference unless you have harakat and ijams. Those don't come into the 8th and 9th century. But nonetheless, this is what the Islamic tradition tells us. This is what Bukhari tells us. See, in Bukhari's day, this was not a problem because there were harakats and there were ijams in Bukhari's day. But he's writing in the 9th century. He doesn't realize what's happening in the 7th century. He didn't do his history lesson very well. This makes no sense. Now, it does make sense for us today. That's all that the Islamic narrative has to go on. The Standard Islamic Narrative is very troubled because this is a real hole, a glaring hole. So then we get and we ask, okay, so what do the Muslims today say? How is it that they are dealing with this? Well, they're saying it's been preserved, every word, every letter, and some would even say even every dot has been preserved. Without thinking through, there were no dots then. The ijams had not yet been invented, so you can't say that. But a lot of them don't look at history. They don't really care about history. And so what they say is, who cares? And so they make this claim, it has been perfectly preserved. I showed you that video of Mansur Ahmad, who is there at Speaker's Corner, who is so clear that it has been preserved that we can find 99%. Oh, well, let's go to 97%. Actually, it turns out to be 96% of the Quran by the 1st century Islam. That means 719, from 622 to 790. So by 719, we can find the entire Quran. And I kept on questioning, are you sure you can find an entire Quran? One manuscript? From the 7th century, first of all, I asked, is it from 652? He was quiet. How about the 7th century? He was quiet. By the time I got to 721, I gave him 2 extra years. He says, you're not listening to me. That's what I've been saying. We have 97% of the Quran. I assumed it was one text. Turns out it was 63 fragments. 63 fragments. And we looked and showed you 20 of them are probably the best that they can get, but there's still dispute amongst those 20. 9 of them are all much later than 727. They shouldn't even use them. And the last 34, no one's done any work on. So these are nothing more than grabbing because they wanted to make up their 96%. They just grabbed here, grabbed there, grabbed there. These are fragments that they didn't hope no one would ever do any research on them. And we did the research on them and we found that they're wanting. So even that they can't claim. So then we went and we asked, well, what about this? What did exist in the 7th century? As we're always doing, we went back to Umar. And this Umar, who is a Jewish king living in Hira, comes over and he wants to get back to Jerusalem because he's a Jew. All Jews want to get back to Jerusalem. Now that the Byzantines had eradicated the Sassanid Empire and they have kind of pulled back because the Byzantine Empire is in retreat at this time. They cannot keep all their soldiers all over the world. And so they're pulling back from these far-reaching areas. And as they pull back, that leaves a vacuum there. So what does our good friend Umar do? Not the Umar from the Quran, not the Umar from Islam. He is the Jewish king living in Hira. He comes over and he takes over and conquers Jerusalem in 638. It walks right into a vacuum that exists. And this Umar befriends a Gabriel. Gabriel is the name for Jibril. Gabriel is not the angel. He's actually a priest. And he befriends him, becomes good friends with him, and Gabriel gives him the Diatessaron, this text that is written in Aramaic to read. He reads it, falls in love with it. Who wouldn't when you read the Diatessaron? You fall in love with Jesus quite easily. And then he converts to Christianity around 644. By 647, he then introduces a coin of his image on it holding a cross. So he's no longer a Jew now, he is a Christian. And then he introduces the word Muhammad. This is the first time we see Muhammad on any text, and it's on this coin in 647, and then he dies that year. Goodbye, Umar. This is not the Umar that the Muslims know about. This is another Umar. But that's interesting, because who is he referring to? Who is this Muhammad? Well, it's the praised one, as we now know. This is probably referring to Jesus Christ. But he's given this Diatessaron, this text in Aramaic. That's interesting, because that's the first inkling that there was now, this was now being introduced in the mid-7th century, around 640, 650. This Diatessaron, this Aramaic text is now being introduced. We wanted to say, well, why is that interesting? Because that text then was taken and was started to be added to. And then we did a really good job of unpacking the dots and the vowels, the harakat and the ijams, what happened between the 7th and 8th century. As we move into the 8th century, they started adding dots, and they started taking this Aramaic text and putting it into Arabic. Remember, the Aramaic is the text of the liturgy, the text of the academia, the text of the educated, the text of the Christian liturgy. And they want to bring it down to layman's terminology. They want to bring it down to the Arabic where the people would understand it. But in order to do that, they have to start to read it. and you saw, you can't read it. I showed you those 2 pages. You can't read it when you look at it because you need the dots and vowels to understand. So they had to add dots and vowels. They had to create dots and vowels. But that was only done at the end of the 7th century, moving into the 8th century. Now, to be fair, Odin cautioned me on this, and I have to make sense. There were some dots and vowels that were already being used in Cairo. The first place to do it was in Cairo, but this is not happening in Baghdad. So in Baghdad, in what was then Ctesiphon and Kirhira, they were not using dots. So it depends on what geography you're talking about. The fact that there's no dots and vowels in the earliest manuscripts suggests to me that they're not in Cairo. These are texts that are coming out of Iraq. Hold that, because that's going to come later too when we start unpacking these manuscripts. So that starts to be dead. And then you start getting this true Proto-Qur'an. And this is where these guys come into being, because then we started coming across this guy down here, Gunther Lulling, in 1970, who introduced and took out the dots and vowels, said, let's just read it without the dots and vowels. He said, hold on a minute, I've seen this before. I know where this comes from. This comes from hymns. And he found that there were hymns. All these beautiful poetry are actually from hymns, but Christian hymns about Jesus Christ. Well, that cost was so explosive in 1970 that he was thrown out of the university system and thrown into obscurity, and was only resurrected when we got this finally introduced into English so the English-speaking world could understand it. So this guy then wrote his book. This is Christoph Luxemburg. He says, let's don't just go with the hymns. Let's go to all those hidden meanings, those dark passages that no one knows about. So we looked at that and we unpacked what Christoph Luxemburg did. But what we did is we went and looked at the 7 steps, the 7 steps that he did. This is called classical textual criticism. You go first to Tabari and you see if you can find. Oh, you can't find much there because that's in the 10th century. So you go to Manzur, Ibn Manzur, and that's in the 13th. Yeah. Go ahead.
Lisan al-Arab.
Lisan al-Arab is the name of the text.
Yeah.
That is the dictionary. That's the Arabic dictionary. But that is from the 13th century. By the 13th century, you have all kinds of words that have been changed. We want to go back to the 7th century and the 8th century when it was being introduced. What were the names of the words? So it didn't help Luxemburg very much to go to those 2. So then he went to, and he took out the dots and he took out the vowels. He said, let's forget about the Arabic. Let's go to the Aramaic. And when he went to the Aramaic, suddenly wholesale, he found reference after reference, story after story, homily after homily, lectionary after lectionary. Hold a minute. Lectionaries? Homilies? Homilies are preachings. Lectionaries? Recitations. Hymns? Worship. All to Jesus Christ. And as he went there, then he said, well, let's go to the lectionaries that are in Aramaic. Let's go to the dictionaries that are in Aramaic. And by the time he went through these 7 different topics, looking and seeing where he could put dots and vowels that are Aramaic dots and vowels, he was able to reproduce the entire 25% that was what we call dark. But then he wanted to go to those letters. And this is where Guillaume Dye has been so good, out of France. Guillaume Dye comes and says, oh, if you look at those letters and you start looking at the letters, you can actually see those letters are not mysterious. They're all
We're talking about the
keys.
mysterious letters here.
These are the lam, aleph,
Lam, Mim, Ha, Mim, all that kind of
These
stuff.
letters are nothing more than keys to different psalms. Of course, most of these are psalms. These are keys to those psalms to let the reader know which psalm he's reading. So when you do that, then you say, well, let's go look at some other references. So we went to this is Guillaume D's work in France on Surah 23 and Surah 70. And when you look at Surah 23, first 11 verses, you have 5 verses that are all the duties of a Christian, ending with, they must be chaste. You must follow chastity. And suddenly interjected, slamming you in the faces, yes, except for those that your right hand possesses and those women, those concubines that you have. So you can have as many women, your concubines, and also those sex slaves. That has nothing to do with chastity. It's a bastardization of the word chastity. And then verse 8 through 11 talks about the rewards in heaven for those who keep the duties. Amen. What was a beautiful hymn about the duties and the rewards for a believer gets bastardized by this desecration of the word chastity. The same thing is repeated in chapter 70, verse 25 to verse 35. Again, interjected with this bastardization by Arabic. And so when you see what they've done to the Quran, you can see that this is all kinds of deletions and accretions, ameliorations, and then you can understand then why what Luxemburg is finding has now been hammered in pieces, and why Lulling was found. When he did this, you can see, because the academia world doesn't want this, because this upsets the apple cart. This takes away their salaries. This takes away all their funding. Because of Muslims who are paying remember, it's the Muslims who are paying for their salaries. It's the Muslims that are paying for their institutions. Their chairs that they've got to protect are coming and make sure that they got to protect them from the Muslims. And that's why they don't want the Gunther Lulings and the Christoph Luxemburgs to be saying what they're saying. Because they are not interested in belief. They're this is an academic exercise for them. For the academics, it's an academic exercise. They do not want the Muslims to get upset. No wonder the academia world dares not even get into this. And that's why I love what these guys have done. I give credit to these two, but I also want to give credit to Gabriel Salma. I want to give credit to this guy. We haven't talked much about him because this guy has been saying, and he's been trying to knock on the door. He's along with all the other guys. Guys, you've been listening to us. We've been trying to tell you, wake up. We've been trying to tell you, we are the ones that know exactly what the Quran is about because this is our language. Mm-hmm. This is our text. Why didn't you ever listen to us? So finally we're listening to them. So all of you go buy this book. It's called The Quran Misinterpreted, Mistranslated, and Misread. The Aramaic Language of the Quran. Written by a man that reads the language, knows both Arabic and Aramaic. You need to go back to the source. When you do that, what do you think you will find? Well, he tells you what you're going to find. And you can see, so does Luxembourg tell you you're going to find. If you take this book and you put it through and you sift it through the sifter, what do you think is going to be waiting for you? What's going to be waiting for you is this book.
Material. Yeah.
You're going to find this book waiting for you. If you take the Issa of this book and you put it through the sifter, you're going to find Yeshua. So from Issa through the sift, you become to Yeshua. From Allah through the sift, you come to
and
Yahweh.
Let me say this. The one on the top contaminated the purity of the one on the bottom.
The purity of the bottom was contaminated because it went through another sifter. It went through from Aramaic to Arabic. We want to take it back to its original source.
That's right.
And when you go back to the original source, who do you think you're going to find? You're going to find Jesus Christ. And we're going to leave the Quran there because that's where it belongs. And we're going to bring people home to this book because this is the real book. This is the real Jesus. This is the real God. This is the real gospel. That which was the Quran, which we start from the very beginning, the archetype that started with Jesus, got bastardized into Issa that I don't recognize. I want nothing to do with that Issa or that God. We need to bring back home again. And we've been saying this over and over again in all of our series. We need to bring them home. Now can you understand why so many of the verses in the Quran says this is an Arabic book for the Arabic people on the Arabic
It's almost
text.
like it's trying to prove itself.
It has to because it's saying in contradistinction to what?
Because apparently there is a lot of attacks against it saying, wait a minute, we know this material. It's not Arabic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Can you see then why we need to bring him home? And for those Muslims who are watching, this is not pleasant for what we've done in this series. We have gone through and we have sifted your SIN, Standard Islamic Narrative. This is part of the Standard Islamic Narrative. And we do not want anything more to do with this book. We leave it on this side because everything that it takes you back to is this book. And we want to bring you home to this book. We want to bring you home to this Jesus. We want to bring you home to this God because this is the God who can save you. This is the Jesus who has died on the cross. He did die on the cross. He rose again. You celebrate Friday, the day he died. We celebrate Sunday, the day he rose again. Friday's here, but Sundays are coming. Why? Because it's Sunday that he destroyed death. It is Sunday that he destroyed SIN. He destroyed sin on Sunday. He destroyed the Standard Islamic Narrative and he destroyed it, all the sin that has been incorporated. He's taken that sin on himself and he is the only one that can redeem you. If you want to know who the real God is, who the real Jesus is, if you want to go back to the biblical Jesus, come on home. Come on home. We'd love to have you.
Amen, brother. Well done. Well said. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Hopefully, you've benefited from this series, and hopefully, it's been a blessing to you. Remember also to consider to be a partner with us via Patreon or even give towards producing videos like this in this quality through PayPal or any other means. And remember to pray for both of us. Until then, God bless you. This is Al Fadi.